The day I turned 16, Sister Agatha called me into her office and told me I was no longer the state's problem. She said it just like that, the state's problem. As if I were a pothole in a road or a leaking pipe in a building that someone had finally decided wasn't worth repairing. She handed me a brown envelope, a cloth bag with my 2 dresses, and a pair of shoes that didn't fit, and informed me that a lawyer from Boone County, West Virginia, had written to say that my maternal grandmother, a woman named Cora Whitfield, whom I had never met, had died 3 months ago and left me her entire estate. Estate was a generous word for what Cora Whitfield had owned. The lawyer's letter described it as 14 acres of steep wooded hillside in Caney's Creek Hollow, including a dwelling in disrepair and a limestone cave formation of no commercial value, currently inaccessible due to overgrowth. The Sisters of Mercy Home for Girls, where I had spent the last 6 years of my life, had a good laugh about that. Sister Agatha read the letter aloud in the dining hall. I still don't know why. Maybe as a lesson about the vanity of earthly possessions. And every girl and every nun in that room looked at me with the same expression. Pity mixed with relief that they weren't me. I didn't cry. I had stopped crying at the Sisters of Mercy home around the age of 12 when I realized that tears were a currency that bought nothing in a place like that. My mother had died of scarlet fever when I was 10. My father had been gone before that. A coal miner who went into the mountain one morning in 1932 and never came out. They found his lamp but not his body after my mother died. There was nobody. No aunts, no uncles, no family that wanted a skinny girl who read too much and talked too little. The state sent me to the Sisters of Mercy in Charleston. And the Sisters of Mercy spent 6 years trying to make me into something useful, a lairess, a seamstress, a future wife for some farmer who needed an extra pair of hands more than he needed a conversation. I was none of those things. I was the girl who stole books from the donation bin and read them under the blanket by candlelight. The girl who asked the science teacher at the public school where we were sent 3 days a week to satisfy the state education requirement why plants grew toward light and whether you could trick them into growing toward a mirror. The girl who kept a notebook full of drawings of leaves and roots and seed structures, and who once got slapped by Sister Constance for spending an hour watching a vine climb a wall instead of scrubbing the laundry floor. If you want to find out what I discovered inside that overgrown cave, and why the same people who laughed at my inheritance went completely silent when they saw what was hidden behind those vines, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Cora Whitfield had concealed in that hillside wasn't just a secret. It was a miracle that had been growing in the dark for 30 years. The bus dropped me in Whitesville on a Thursday afternoon in late March 1942. The town was small and gray and tired, a coal town whose best years were behind it. Its main street lined with buildings that leaned like old men who'd given up standing straight. The lawyer, Mr. Peton, was a round man with tobacco-stained fingers who drove me 12 up a dirt road into the mountains in a truck that smelled like dog and kerosene. Your grandmother was a particular woman, he said, which I was learning was the Appalachian way of saying someone was strange. Lived alone up in that hollow for near 40 years. Didn't come to town but twice a year. People left her alone and she returned the favor. Did anyone know her? I asked. Knew of her. She grew things. Had a garden people talked about, though most never saw it. After the cave got overgrown, she stopped letting anyone near the property. Last 10 years of her life, nobody went up there at all. He dropped me at the end of a path that was more suggestion than road. 2 ruts in the mud disappearing into rhododendron so thick it made a tunnel. He handed me a key, a $5 bill, and a handshake that felt like an apology. The cabin's about 4 miles up, he said. The cave is behind it. Somewhere in the hill. I've never been inside. Don't know anyone who has, not in years. The whole entrance got swallowed up by kudzu and wild grape about 15-20 years ago. Your grandmother never cleared it. Why not? Mr. Peton shrugged. Like I said, particular woman, I walked up that path alone, carrying everything I owned in one hand, and I thought, this is either the beginning of something or the end of everything. There was no middle ground. I was 16, orphaned, uneducated beyond the 8th grade, and walking into a hollow in the West Virginia mountains where nobody knew my name and nobody cared whether I lived or died. The cabin was small but not hopeless. 1 room, plank floor, stone fireplace, a roof that needed patching but hadn't collapsed. My grandmother's possessions were sparse and strange. A bed, a table, a wood stove, jars of dried herbs lining every windowsill. And books. So many books. Not novels or Bibles, but books on botany, on soil chemistry, on mycology, on something called permaculture that I'd never heard of. There were hand-drawn diagrams pinned to the walls, cross-sections of root systems, sketches of fungal networks, maps of the hillside with careful notations about soil depth and sun exposure and water flow. And on the table, as if she'd been writing it the day she died, an open journal. The last entry in handwriting that trembled but was still precise read, "The cave holds everything. If she comes, if the girl comes, she must clear the entrance. She must see what I built. The vines or the door. What's behind them is the answer." She had been waiting for me. A grandmother I'd never known had been waiting for a granddaughter she'd never met. And she had left me a message like a hand reaching out from the grave. I sat at that table, and I pressed my palms flat against the wood, and I breathed. Then I went outside to find the cave. It took me 3 days just to locate the entrance. My grandmother had not exaggerated about the overgrowth. The hillside behind the cabin rose steeply, maybe 200 feet to the ridge, and it was covered in a wall of vegetation so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. Kudzu had colonized the lower slope in thick ropey curtains. Wild grapevines as thick as my wrist were through the kudzu in a tangled mesh. Virginia creeper climbed the rock face underneath, and honeysuckle filled every remaining gap. It was beautiful in its way, a green fortress, impenetrable and alive, but it had swallowed whatever was behind it completely. I found the entrance on the 3rd day, not by seeing it, but by feeling air. I was pulling at a section of kudzu near the base of the cliff. I'd been working my way along the rock face, yanking vines, cutting with my grandmother's rusty hand sickle when I felt it. A breath of cold air against my sweating face. Not wind, something deeper. Air that came from inside the earth. Cool and damp and constant. I cut faster. I pulled vines until my hands bled. I hacked at grape stems and tore at kudzu roots that had anchored themselves into the limestone like they were trying to hold the mountain shut. And as the afternoon light shifted and came through the canopy at an angle, I saw it. A darkness behind the green. A gap in the rock face, maybe 5 feet wide and 6 feet tall, framed by limestone and completely curtained by 30 years of unchecked growth. The entrance to the cave. It took me another 2 full days to clear it. I worked from dawn until my arms wouldn't lift the sickle anymore. Then I slept. Then I started again. I piled cut vines and mounds that grew taller than me. I pulled root systems out of cracks in the limestone that had been growing since before I was born. I uncovered the rock face inch by inch. And as I did, I began to see something that made me work faster. Marks in the stone. Carved marks, letters, and numbers chiseled into the limestone above the entrance, barely visible under decades of growth. When I finally cleared enough to read them, I stood back and stared. C. Whitfield, 1913. My grandmother had marked this cave the year she claimed it nearly 30 years ago, and she had let the vines seal it shut. I lit the kerosene lantern I'd found in the cabin, held it in front of me, and stepped inside. The first chamber was unremarkable. A natural limestone passage, maybe 8 feet wide and just tall enough to stand in, running about 30 feet into the hillside. The walls were damp, the floor was smooth from centuries of water flow, and the air was cool, around 55 degrees, I guessed, the same constant temperature that caves hold year-round, regardless of the season above. My footsteps echoed. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness ahead. Then the passage opened up and I understood why my grandmother had sealed the cave. Not to hide it, to protect it. The main chamber was enormous, at least 80 feet long and 40 feet wide with a ceiling that arched up into shadows beyond the lantern's reach. But it wasn't the size that stopped me. It was what was growing inside. Mushrooms. Hundreds, no, thousands of mushrooms covering every surface. They grew from logs that had been arranged in careful rows along the chamber floor. Oak and poplar logs, I could tell, cut to uniform lengths and stacked in configurations that I would later learn were called totem stacks. They grew from shelves my grandmother had carved into the limestone walls filled with substrate, a mix of straw and wood chips and something dark and rich that smelled like forest floor. They grew from hanging bags suspended from wooden frames bolted to the ceiling, cascading downward in pale luminous clusters that caught the lantern light and seemed to glow. And they weren't just one kind. As I walked deeper into the chamber, my lantern trembling in my shaking hand, I counted species I recognized from my grandmother's books and species I'd never seen. Oyster mushrooms in gray and pearl and blue, fanning out from log ends and overlapping shelves. Sheet caps pushing through bark in neat brown rows. lion's mane tumbling from high shelves in white shaggy waterfalls. And deeper in the cave in a section where the temperature dropped a few degrees and the moisture was heavier. Something I had only ever seen in pictures. Clusters of what looked like chanterelles, golden and ruffled, growing from a substrate my grandmother had somehow engineered to mimic forest soil. She had built an underground mushroom farm. Not a small one, not a hobby or an experiment, but a full-scale, meticulously designed cultivation facility hidden inside a mountain. The logs were old, but many were still producing. The substrate bags, though some had dried out, showed evidence of being replenished over years. Layers of fresh material added on top of old, like geological strata of my grandmother's labor. The growing shelves were built to maximize the cave's natural humidity and airflow. The wooden frames were positioned to take advantage of the slight air currents that moved through the cave system. Every single element had been thought through with the precision of someone who understood fungi not as a gardener, but as a scientist. I sank to the floor and sat among the mushrooms in the dark. And I laughed. I laughed until I cried. And then I cried until I laughed again. My grandmother, the particular woman nobody visited, the recluse in the hollow, the strange old Cora Whitfield who grew things, had spent 30 years building a cathedral of fungi inside a cave. And when she knew she was dying, she had let the vines grow over the entrance like a living lock, sealed it shut with nature itself, and waited for me to come and open it. The first weeks were a desperate education. I had the cave and I had my grandmother's library, but I had almost no food, no money, and no understanding of what I was looking at beyond a gut feeling that it was extraordinary. I survived on what the land offered. Wild ramps along the creek, dandelion greens, a patch of wild asparagus I found on the south-facing slope, and cautiously carefully consulting 3 different books before I put anything near my mouth, the mushrooms themselves. The oysters were unmistakable and safe. I cooked them over the wood stove with wild garlic and ate until my stomach hurt. Not from illness, but from the simple shock of having enough. Meanwhile, I read everything. My grandmother's journals, I found 6 of them in a trunk under the bed, told the full story. Cora Whitfield had come to Kenny's Creek Hollow in 1910. A young widow with a knowledge of plants that she'd learned from her own mother, a Cherokee herbalist from the koala boundary. She had discovered the cave in 1913, recognized its potential, the stable temperature, the constant humidity, the clean limestone environment, and had begun experimenting with mushroom cultivation using techniques that blended indigenous knowledge with the emerging European science of mycology. By the 1920s, she was producing mushrooms year-round in quantities that stunned even her. The cave's conditions were nearly perfect. The temperature never varied more than 2 degrees. The humidity held steady at 90%. The limestone filtered the water that seeped through the walls, and the natural airflow prevented the mold and contamination that plagued above-ground cultivation. She had developed her own substrate formulas, her own inoculation techniques, her own methods for extending the productive life of fruiting logs far beyond what the textbook said was possible. She had also discovered something that the scientific community wouldn't formally document for another 40 years, the underground fungal network. In her journal dated 1931, she wrote, "The mushrooms are not separate organisms. They are the fruit of a single vast network, a web of threads running through the soil and the wood and the stone itself. Feed the network and it feeds you. The cave is not a farm. It is a living thing and I am its keeper." My grandmother had understood mycelium, the underground root network of fungi, decades before it became a subject of mainstream research. She had nurtured the network in her cave the way a gardener nurtures soil, and in return, the network produced mushrooms with a reliability and abundance that no surface farm could match. The first person to find me was Ida Combs. Ida was 68 years old, a widow who lived in a cabin about 2 m down the creek. She appeared at my door one May morning carrying a jar of honey and a look of profound suspicion. "You the Whitfield girl?" she asked. "I'm Nettie Whitfield, Cora's granddaughter. Cora said you'd come." Ida peered past me into the cabin. She told me years back said she had a granddaughter in an orphanage in Charleston and that one day the girl would come for the cave. "You knew about the cave?" "I knew Cora grew mushrooms. She brought me baskets of them for 20 years. Best food I ever ate. When she got too old to tend them, she sealed it up. Said it would keep until you arrived." Ida looked me up and down. "You're skinnier than I expected." Ida became my lifeline. She taught me what my grandmother's journals couldn't. The practical physical knowledge of surviving in the mountains. How to repair the cabin roof with hand-split shingles. How to identify which creek water was safe to drink. How to store food through the winter. How to read the sky and know whether tomorrow would bring rain or frost. She was gruff and unsentimental, and she never once hugged me. But she came every week, and she always brought something. A sack of cornmeal, a dozen eggs, a wool blanket she claimed she didn't need anymore. In return, I fed her mushrooms. And as I learned my grandmother's methods, and the cave's production increased, I began to feed others too. By the autumn of 1942, I was harvesting more mushrooms than I could eat in a month. The cave was a relentless producer. The mycelial network that Cora had spent 30 years nurturing was mature and vigorous, spreading through the logs and substrate with an energy that amazed me. I refreshed the old logs with new ones I cut from the surrounding forest. I mixed fresh substrate using my grandmother's formulas. I repaired the growing shelves and rehung the ceiling bags. And the cave responded the way a living thing responds to care. It gave back more than I put in. I began carrying baskets to Whitesville every Saturday. The walk was long, 12 miles round trip, and the reception was cold. People in coal towns don't trust what they don't understand. And a 16-year-old girl selling cave-grown mushrooms in a region where most people had never eaten anything fancier than a button mushroom from a can was, to put it mildly, a hard sell. What's wrong with them was the most common question. Why do they look like that? Was the second a man named Earl Sizemore told me to my face that cave mushrooms were probably poisonous, and that I ought to be ashamed of myself for trying to sell them to honest people. But hunger has a way of opening minds that argument never can. The war had thinned the valley. Men were overseas. Meat was rationed. Money was scarce. And here was this girl with baskets of fresh, beautiful, substantial food. Food that tasted like the forest and filled you up and cost almost nothing because the girl growing it was too proud to charge what it was worth and too desperate to charge nothing. Mrs. Lucille Barton was the first real customer. She was the wife of a miner who'd been drafted. Mother of 4, stretched so thin you could see the worry through her skin. She bought a pound of oyster mushrooms for 10 cents, took them home, and fried them in butter. The next Saturday, she brought her sister. The Saturday after that, her sister brought 3 neighbors. By December, I had a line. The winter of 1942 was when I discovered the second secret of the cave. I had been exploring the deeper passages. My grandmother's journals mentioned a back chamber she had used for cold weather species. When I found a narrow tunnel leading off the main chamber, partially blocked by a rockfall that looked deliberate. It took me 2 days to clear the rocks. And when I squeezed through into the space beyond, I found something that made me sit down on the cold stone floor and press my hands to my mouth. My grandmother had built a seed vault. The back chamber was smaller, maybe 20 feet across, and drier than the main cave. Along every wall, on shelves carved into the limestone, were jars. Hundreds of jars, mason jars, canning jars, old medicine bottles, anything glass with a tight seal. And inside each jar, carefully labeled in my grandmother's handwriting, were seeds, tomato seeds, bean seeds, corn seeds, squash seeds, pepper seeds, herb seeds, flower seeds, seeds from varieties I'd never heard of. Cherokee purple, greasy back bean, candy roaster squash, turkey craw bean. Names that sang of a history and a culture that had been systematically erased, pushed out by commercial agriculture and the forced displacement of the people who had bred these plants over centuries. My grandmother had been saving seeds, not casually, not as a hobby, but with the methodical thoroughness of someone preserving a civilization. Her journal explained it. They are taking the old varieties. The seed companies want farmers to buy new seeds every year. Hybrid seeds that don't breed true, that make you dependent. The Cherokee seeds, the ones my mother gave me, the ones her mother gave her. These are being lost. I am saving what I can. The cave keeps them cool and dry. They will last decades. Someone must plant them again. I held a jar of seeds labeled Cherokee Trail of Tears bean for my mother, 1894. And I understood my grandmother hadn't just built a mushroom farm. She had built an ark, a genetic library of heirloom and indigenous plant varieties stored in the one place where time moved slowly enough to preserve them. A cool, dry, dark cave where seeds could remain viable for generations. The mushrooms were the harvest. The seeds were the legacy. That spring, I planted. I cleared terraces on the south-facing slope above the cabin. Using the same method I'd read about in one of Cora's books, stacking limestone into low walls to hold soil on the steep hillside. I composted mushroom substrate from the cave, spent logs, and used growing medium that were rich with nutrients, and mixed it into the thin mountain soil. And I opened my grandmother's jars one by one, and put those ancient seeds into the ground. They grew. Lord, how they grew. Cherokee purple tomatoes the color of bruises, so sweet they made your eyes close. Greasy back beans that climbed 8 feet and produced pods until frost. Candy roaster squash that swelled to 20 pounds and stored through the entire winter. Herbs my grandmother had labeled only in Cherokee. Plants I later learned were traditional medicines that the koala community had been growing for centuries. Ida Holmes watched the terraces fill with color and abundance and shook her head slowly. Your grandmother told me she was keeping something safe, Ida said. I thought she meant the mushrooms. She meant all of it. By 1944, I was running 2 operations. The cave mushroom farm below and the heritage seed garden above. Together, they made the little hollow in Caney's Creek one of the most productive pieces of land in the county. I traded mushrooms and vegetables in Whitesville. I gave food to families with men overseas. I began saving my own seeds from each harvest, expanding the collection, learning which varieties thrived in the mountain climate and which needed more care. Word spread. A professor from Marshall University, Dr. Helen Marsh, a botanist who had been documenting the loss of heirloom varieties across Appalachia, heard about my seed collection and drove 3 hours to see it. She walked through the cave vault with tears running down her face. Do you know what you have here? She said. Some of these varieties were thought to be extinct. This one. She held up a jar labeled Bloody Butcher Corn, 1902. The last known planting of this strain was in 1918. Your grandmother saved it. She saved a lot of things. I said she just needed someone to plant them. Dr. Marsh helped me catalog the collection. We documented over 200 distinct varieties. Beans, corn, squash, tomatoes, peppers, herbs and flowers. Many of them traceable to Cherokee and Appalachian farming traditions dating back centuries. She connected me with the State Agricultural Extension Service with university seed banks with a growing network of people who understood that the loss of seed diversity was not just a farming problem but a cultural catastrophe. In 1947, a man came to the hollow who changed the last piece of my life that needed changing. His name was Joseph Wynn, a returning soldier from Mingo County who had studied agriculture on the GI Bill and heard about the woman in Caney's Creek who was growing things nobody else could grow. He came to see the cave and stayed to see me. He was quiet and steady and had hands that were gentle with seedlings and rough with rock. And when I showed him the seed vault, the hundreds of jars, the careful labels, the 30 years of one woman's defiance against forgetting, he sat in that cool chamber for a long time and then said, "This is the most important room I've ever been in." We married in the fall. We raised 3 children in that hollow, and every one of them learned to tend the cave and the terraces and the seeds before they learned to read. Joseph expanded the mushroom operation into a proper business. We supplied restaurants in Charleston and Huntington, dried mushrooms for sale through the mail, and trained other families in the county to start their own cultivation using logs and substrate from our surplus. Ida Combs died in 1953 at 80 on a bright October day. I buried her on the hill above the cabin where she could see the terraces she'd watched me build, and I planted Cherokee purple tomatoes on her grave because she'd said once they were the best thing she'd ever tasted, and she wanted to taste them forever. The Whitfield Heritage Seed Bank, as Dr. Marsh had formerly named it, grew every year. We distributed seeds to farmers across Appalachia, to university research programs, to indigenous communities working to reclaim their agricultural heritage. By the 1960s, the collection held over 400 varieties. By the 1970s, it was recognized by the Department of Agriculture as one of the most significant private seed preservation efforts in the eastern United States. People came from everywhere. Farmers, scientists, journalists, students. They walked through the cave and saw the mushrooms glowing in the lantern light. And then I took them to the back chamber and showed them the jars. And every single one of them went quiet. The same silence that fell over Whitesville the first time people understood what was inside that overgrown cave. Not the silence of embarrassment, but the silence of awe. I was asked once by a reporter from the Charleston Gazette whether I was angry at the people who had laughed at my inheritance. They laughed because they couldn't see past the vines. I said, most people can't. They look at the surface, the overgrowth, the rocks, the girl from the orphanage, and they think that's all there is. They don't have the patience to clear away what's covering the entrance. They don't believe there's anything worth finding inside. And you did? No, I said. I just had nowhere else to go. Sometimes that's enough. Joseph died in 1979 gently in autumn, the way good men die when they've lived honest lives. Sitting on the porch with soup on the stove and the sound of the creek below. I buried him next to Ida on the hill. I kept working. My children took over the business, the mushroom operation, the seed distribution, the educational programs we built for young farmers. But I tended the cave myself until the very end. Every morning I walked into that limestone chamber, checked the temperature, checked the humidity, checked the logs and the bags and the shelves, and talked to the mycelium. The way my grandmother must have talked to it for 30 years before me. I died in the spring of 1986 at the age of 60. They found me in the cave sitting against the wall of the back chamber with a jar of seeds in my lap. Cherokee Trail of Tears beans, the very first jar I'd ever opened. My daughter said I looked peaceful. My son said I looked like I was home. The cave is still producing. The seed bank holds over 600 varieties now, managed by my granddaughter and a staff of 12. The mushroom operation supplies half the restaurants in southern West Virginia. And every year in March, they hold the Cora Whitfield Heritage Seed Festival on the terraces above the hollow, where families come from across the state to trade seeds and swap stories and plant things that should have been lost but weren't because one woman had the foresight to save them, and another had the stubbornness to clear the vines and find them. Above the cave entrance, cut into the limestone where my grandmother carved her name in 1913, my children added a second line. Nettie Whitfield Wynne. She cleared the way. So, let me ask you something. What's growing behind the vines in your life? What inheritance have you been given? Not of money or land, but of knowledge, of tradition, of something someone before you tried to preserve, that you haven't looked at closely enough. What overgrown entrance are you walking past every day, assuming there's nothing inside worth the effort of clearing? Because here's what I learned in 40 years of tending a cave. The most valuable things are almost always hidden. Not because they're small or insignificant, but because the world grows over them. Neglect covers them. Time buries them. And most people walk past because clearing the vines is hard, dirty, thankless work that nobody will applaud you for until they see what's behind them. My grandmother spent 30 years building something extraordinary inside a mountain. And then she let the forest seal it shut and trusted that the right person would come along and open it again. She was right. Not because I was special, but because I was desperate enough to try and patient enough to keep going. The vines are not the obstacle. They're the test. And what's behind them is always worth the work. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the sealed-up places in your own life that might be hiding something extraordinary, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who cleared the path and found what was waiting on the other side. Your cave is overgrown. Your grandmother is waiting. Start clearing.